marking 30 years since the end of apartheid. While South Africans may now share equal rights under the law, some say a form of economic apartheid has taken hold instead. Huge gaps between rich and poor have many complaining that little has changed in 30 years. But was that inevitable, or have politicians simply failed South Africa? I'm Andrea Sanke, and today's Newsmaker is South Africa. This weekend marks Freedom Day in South Africa, 30 years since the ANC and Nelson Mandela rose to power after decades of often brutal, institutionalized segregation. There was immeasurable hope and promise when apartheid fell, and for many years, South Africa was on the up. The economy was booming, and the standard of living increased for the vast majority, with basic services finally delivered to impoverished areas. But today, even those basic services are in question. Here's a look.
February the 11th, 1990 was the day millions of black South Africans had waited decades for. On that afternoon, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison hand in hand with his then-wife Winnie. Huge crowds had waited for hours to witness the release of their hero, who had spent 27 years in prison for fighting against the apartheid system of legalized racial segregation in the country. As tens of thousands lined the streets of Cape Town, millions more worldwide were glued to their television sets. 4 years later, Nelson Mandela was sworn in as South Africa's first black president. But the inspirational leader and international icon only served one term as head of state. He officially retired from public life in 2004. Since the end of white minority rule in 1994, South Africa has held 6 peaceful elections, all free and fair, and all won by Mandela's former liberation movement and political party, the African National Congress, or ANC. But many of the issues faced by voters 30 years ago remain.
My hope for the future is to see our community being successful in terms of service delivery, running water, and then the pavement in our society, because when it rains sometimes the vehicles or the cars are struggling to get in because there is some mud and it is too wet.
South Africa is the continent's most industrialized country and its second biggest economy. But in recent years, it's experienced a downturn due to high unemployment, poor service delivery, and a rise in violent crime. Millions are facing the same economic challenges as those during apartheid. Furthermore, inequality is high, persistent, and has increased since 1994, that's according to the World Bank. When it comes to reducing poverty, progress has slowed. Many argue the problems persist because of rampant corruption from the President's office down.
We need to be able to send a clear message to South Africans that if you're tired of corruption, if you're tired of load shedding, if you're tired of your job being put onto short time, you're tired of looking for work every single day, that there is hope for a better future.
In its 2023 Corruption Perception Index, Transparency International ranked South Africa 83rd out of 180 countries, whereas it was ranked 21st in 1995. One of the key promises of the ANC after coming to power was to redistribute land, but progress has been achingly slow, and more than 70% of the country's arable land is still owned by white farmers. South Africans go to the polls on May the 29th, 30 years after the first free and fair elections. And as campaigning becomes more intense, politicians are focusing on reducing poverty. History could be made with many polls indicating the ANC will dip below the 50% majority threshold for the first time.
So how is South Africa faring 30 years after the fall of apartheid, and how will that manifest in next month's national election? Well, joining me now to debate that are from Pretoria, former South African diplomat and independent political analyst Botsang Moiloa. From Johannesburg is the national spokesperson for the Democratic Alliance, Malatsi. And from London is African news analyst and broadcaster Thamsanqa Zhou. Unfortunately, we had 2 last-minute cancellations from ANC spokespeople, but we will continue this discussion without them. Thanks all so much for being with me. Botsang, I'll start with you because as someone who used to represent the ANC as a diplomat, you can tell us how much South Africa has to be proud of after the fall of apartheid.
Well, good afternoon to your viewers and the fellow panelists and yourself. Then, let me just first correct the narrative that I represented the ANC. I represented South Africa as a country, a multi-party, country, not a political party, the ANC. Although the ANC is in power in South Africa, is the leading party. But going back to the topic of the day, look, one has to be realistic and say, the 30 years of pro-democracy in South Africa, or past democracy, 1994 in South Africa, have been better than it was during apartheid. That is a fact. However, one has to look, colleagues, at why did South Africa go into a liberation movement struggle, which included guerrilla warfare and armed struggle. The main purpose for the formation of the African National Congress and other political parties after, and to go into exile and underground, it was primarily for the return of the stolen land from the African people, and that hasn't happened. As we speak, where we are today, still more than 73% of land ownership in South Africa, it is still in the hands of the minority people. But generally, as compared to other African states or anywhere in the world where people fought for the liberation, we should be proud as a nation that we never went into a war post-democracy, post-elections. There has been peace in the country. There has been political stability. That's one element we should be proud of. But when we speak of war and guerrilla war, as well as skirmishes after the liberation movement, South Africa is faced with a different war completely. We are faced with a war of poverty. We are faced with a war of landlessness. We are faced with a war of unemployment and many other things. It is so unsafe to live in South Africa at the moment, not because there's a war of soldiers fighting, but there's a criminal activity of murder, rape. We are the leading, country in the world, not so proud. So those are some of the challenges we are faced with.
Understood. Let me get Solly's perspective on this because, has the government actually done the best it can, given the circumstances when it came to power? And, is its failure on land redistribution, for example, as Botsang was saying, is that really what the measurement is for the potential failure of the ANC, or is there a lot more to it?
Thanks for this opportunity. And I agree with bits of what Botsang was saying with regard to, the journey that South Africa made from apartheid into democracy. And I think in recognition of that fact, there is no illusion that we live under, that the country is post-apartheid is better than it was during apartheid. But I think the biggest disappointment for many South Africans has been the legacy of the ANC's tenure in government, resulting in the war that Botsang was talking about. Currently, South Africa is experiencing high levels and unprecedented levels of violent crime. A woman is more likely to be raped or violated on the streets of our country every day. In fact, the most recent stats that were out, and there were that 75 rapes occur daily in South Africa. Unemployment is at an unprecedented level. So when you look at each and every metric of progress in life, you'll realize that the government has underachieved, and that has been the biggest disappointment in there. But when you look in terms of the health of our democracy, this is the one area that across the political spectrum, as South Africans, it is one thing that we can be proud of in terms of the health of our democracy, the levels of political tolerance, even in instances where there is political intolerance. It is so minimal that it hasn't exploded to the extent that it has in many parts of the continent. But I think it would be a mistake to use the barometer of apartheid as a measure of progress that post-apartheid South Africa has made, because the promise of our democracy and the promise of the Rainbow Nation, which is what made the world to watch and observe South Africa's transition and why our story, it is still such a beautiful story of transition, was in the hope that life will ultimately become better, not only for the majority of Black South Africans who were deprived of the opportunities in apartheid, but for all South Africans, so that even if there are socio-economic problems, there can be a sense that our country is, marching in the right direction. And currently it isn't. And a large part of that has to relate to the tenure of the ANC's failures in government.
Okay, let me get Thamsanqa's perspective here, because Thamsanqa, I should say you're actually not South African, but you know the country very well, and you are a political analyst. So what's your take on these 30 years? Did the government overpromise and underdeliver, which is the state of most politicians and leadership, or were there mistakes mostly involving corruption that so many South Africans complain about, and ignoring fundamental problems, not least, for example, the white paper that was published decades ago about the problems Eskom and the basic electricity grid would have that were ignored entirely, and now we're seeing that manifest across the country? That was something the government could have addressed, and there's, for example, many accuse it of the massive failure in service delivery today.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on the program, and also it's good to catch up with my brothers from South Africa. And of course, I hold a Zimbabwean passport, but I come from, my grandmother and my grandfather were born just by the border when there was no border. When, Zimbabwe and South Africa were still one country before they were divided by the colonial system. So in the way that we relate back home, whether you're Zimbabwean or South African, does not matter. The borders are artificial with the same people, we speak the same languages.
Okay.
So my view is that the reason why I'm saying that is because people in Southern Africa, what was called the frontline states, are vested in the liberation of South Africa. Zimbabweans, Mozambicans, Swati, Angolans, Tswana, Zambians, Tanzanians, all these people looked after South Africans during the apartheid time when the war was going on before the freedom came. So that freedom that people talk about, the 30 years, is a shared job that all the countries in the southern region had. So what happens after 1994 with the freedom, with the independence, is so much, encompassing all the people around. Our view, or my view, is that having freedom is the most important thing. What you do with it, or what South Africans have been able to do with it, whether the government has been able to achieve their aspirations or, meet some of the things that the people wanted, is a totally different thing. You see that even in America, hundreds of years took here, it still has, challenges, you're still having elections. So for me, just having that independence was a success. And then you have a democratic society where people like Soli, my colleague here, even is sitting on the same benches with people who did not see someone of his color as an equal human being before
Right.
during the apartheid. So I think they have done very well. The progress appears to be slow, but it is in the right direction.
Okay. It's interesting, though, because we'll hear so many people, Botsang, I can come back to you, really complain that too many people were just left behind, and that there has been a tremendous, actually, slide backwards because, for example, even on the corruption index, South Africa used to rate relatively highly, and now they've fallen down. I actually had the numbers. They've fallen from 83rd out of 180 countries to 21st. 21st in 1995 when Mandela first took off, and now they're 83rd. That's a tremendous drop. Plus, as we said, people just feel that they haven't seen any of the progress that was promised. So what is it that South Africa isn't doing right to deliver to its people? Why are there these complaints? I know there is something to celebrate. There are also notable milestones. You joined BRICS. You hosted the World Cup. But it is not, people are saying, indicative of the greater South African good.
As I have said at the beginning of our conversation, am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, yes. As I said at the beginning of our conversation, we as a nation, we are supposed to look at why did we go into a liberation struggle. And I've explained it before. But you are mentioning a very important aspect to say, despite all these beautiful transitions that we are talking about, there is something that has been hampering the growth of South Africa in terms of economic development and upliftment of particularly the African people who were marginalized before. And the main cause of that, I can tell you, colleagues, it is not because the ruling ANC or the government did not have proper policies to can uplift the lives of African people. It is the lack of implementation of those policies. And I've been in government for over 27 years to can know that. And part of the reason why the government failed to implement the good policies that we have, like the Reconstruction and Development Program, as GISA, and many others. We've got the National Development Program at the moment. The reason it was mainly in my observation and view because of corruption within government. You are correct with the statistics that you have mentioned to say we moved from 21 in 1994 and we are apparently at around 84 at the moment. So it's a clear sign that corruption is much of a bigger problem. And let me tell you, corruption comes in many ways. If you are sitting in a ministerial or strategic government position and you are corrupt in terms of rendering a service to the people, then people will not see the end results of what they're expecting from government. And I mean, we are sitting with rates of unemployment increasing annually, at shocking rates. We are sitting with youth in South Africa who were born and they're in the majority age of employment, 30 now, who were born in 1994. We can't tell them about the liberation struggle as the main reason. We should be able to tell them what have we done as a nation from 1994 to today for them to find themselves educated, but unemployed and sitting at home, the use of drugs. But again, it is corruption. And not only that, we shouldn't look at employment only. We shouldn't look at government service. We should look at land ownership, which will translate to the entrepreneurship. When you look at the owners of the economy in South Africa, those who still own the mines and minerals, those who still own the factories, those companies that are listed in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, it is still the white minority because the government failed to stimulate the economy, failed to invest in the economy to can uplift directly the white people. But in conclusion on that.
Yeah, we're running short on time. And Soli, I wanted to ask you then, because, Botsang admits that it was the failure to implement some of the policies that the ANC had promised. I mean, one of those policies was to stop what people are labeling now the economic apartheid of South Africa, was black economic empowerment. Many complained it hasn't delivered. Instead, it created a sort of black elite, and too much of the wealth that ended up being shared at the top was only given to a small few of the black population instead, rather than spreading it amongst the poorest. So the corruption is there, the failure of the policies are there. I mean, will the ANC still remain the party of the majority, though, because people still associate the ANC with their liberation?
Yeah, before we get to that, you asked a very important question earlier, which is, did the ANC overpromise in 1994? In honesty, it didn't overpromise. What the promise of 1994 and even subsequent to that was about doing and getting the basics of delivery right in government. And that is where I think the biggest letdown has been. And that has trickled into the ineptitude that you see in the public service. At the root of that being cadre deployment, right? And that has trickled into the inefficiencies that you see across municipalities. But I think second to that was corruption has found fertile soil within the ANC and government because of the high contestation of internal organizational factions that have been at the center of contestation of state resources, and to a great extent, even mobilizing state resources for internal battle wars. I think one of the biggest mistakes that the government made, and which was a result of ANC policy resolution, was the disbandment of the Scorpions, which was an anti-corruption busting unit that had been making inroads, particularly with regards to politicians that were involved in corrupt activities and unethically influencing the business of the state. Any projection right now in terms of the future of governance in the country indicates that the future of governance in South Africa is coalitions. when you look in the trends in terms of what happened in the local government elections of 2016, excuse me, where for the first time the ANC lost the majority rule in key metros such as Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Ekurhuleni. And also when you look in terms of results of the 2019 elections, there is a high probability that no party will get over 50% on its own in these upcoming elections. Therefore, you're going to see two probabilities in terms of the future of governance. One would be a coalition led by the ANC and the parties that it identifies with. Some of those parties already have a working arrangement with the ANC in Johannesburg. And possibly you're going to see an emergence of the opposition around what was pioneered by the Democratic Alliance, being my party, which is the multi-party charter. But the reality is that the future of governance in South Africa is going to be through coalitions. The shape and form of those coalitions will be determined post the 29th of May when we go to the elections.
Okay, let me ask Thamsanqa, though. I mean, coalitions or otherwise, can a government now really fix the situation and deliver again what was initially promised when apartheid fell? Because there are many who say that, for example, just basic education, that a generation has now been lost because the promises on education were not delivered. And that is also why they see massive unemployment among the youth and those even in their middle age. They were never given the proper skills to enter the workforce because education promises failed. So where is South Africa now? I mean, can it, with this election or without, can it actually correct the fundamental issues that are harming this population, or has it gone too far?
No, I think the first thing is we have to acknowledge, I'm always on the positive side. And I will tell you that the black majority parties that have run South Africa post-independence have done very well. You have to compare what South Africa has been able to achieve in the last 30 years to what probably other African countries that became independent in the 60s were able to, or how many strides they were able to take in the direction of what people might call progress. Look at the Francophone Africa, West Africa, most of these countries. You can't compare them to the life of an average South African today. You can't compare what the ANC government in all its various forms, whether they're talking about the EFF guys when they were still there as the youth, or MK party when former President Zuma was there, or Lekota and Holomisa even, and others that have since left. South Africa has made so much progress. Just being able to host the World Cup, look at their tourism numbers, look at the economy. South Africa is probably still the biggest economy. That means there are so many opportunities for these South Africans that are growing up. So I don't want to give the impression, of course, when you go into an election year, when you look at any generation, there is more that needs to be done. There are education issues that need to be addressed. There are job opportunity issues that need to be addressed. So, but by and large, I would like to say South Africa must not be beating themselves up for not making as much progress as they would have wanted, because compared to the rest of African countries that became independent before them, they actually further than anybody else.
Let me ask Botsang then. I mean, the final question, and please just 1 minute answer if you can. People now look at South Africa and say, wow, went from all these promises after apartheid, all this hope, and now it has the largest wealth gap in the world. And therefore, the government has really failed its people. But then there are others who say, no, that's actually indicative of the world. Every country has seen a growth in its wealth gap, and South Africa is no exception. And it actually is, as Thamsanqa was saying, a model for Africa still today.
Well, I agree partially with him that there has been growth and development, and it is not a doomsday. There is still hope, and the situation may be wrestled and improved. However, we have to deal with those that we entrust with service delivery, political office bearers, to be able to do more. We have the ability, we have the resources, we have the skills. It is about applying all those properly for the benefit of the nation. If we don't do that, we will fail and we'll find ourselves in a worse situation. Look,
Okay.
30 years, it's normal period that African countries have experienced before the start of the decline and the drop in governance. It's normal for where we are at the moment, but we can do better as a nation.
Okay. Soli, quick final words?
I absolutely agree with Botsang that we can do better as a nation. And that starts with, us as political parties, regardless of whether we're in government or not, because often the biggest obstacles to progress, either in government or in opposition, are political parties, right? And that is linked to the quality and the caliber of leadership that we get to elect into public office. And I think where there can be improvement is about ethical leadership in the public sector, ethical leadership in politics, and ethical leadership so that there can be accountability for wrongdoing in governance.
Okay.
If there is accountability for wrongdoing in governance, we'll be able to reverse some of the major obstacles that stand in the way of service delivery, progress, and good governance in South Africa.
Okay, Soli Malatsi, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sanke. We will see you next time.